is scheduled to start in 4 minutes, 3 seconds. Welcome to Blog Talk Radio. Please hold and you will be able to listen to the show. You are now in the host queue.
Latino Rebels Radio. We are back after a 3-week hiatus. We're in Calavarela, Julito 77, going solo tonight with my wonderful co-host, Sharik Delgadillo, has the night off. Because she's with family as La Plebe, Venas Abiertas, is playing in the background. Latino Rebels Radio, we are back. This is live. It is Sunday, April 12th, 10 o'clock on the East Coast, 7 o'clock on the West Coast, and we're going to spend the next hour about a book that I have called an instant classic, and it's called War Against All Puerto Ricans. And we're going to have the author, Nelson A. Dennis, on right now. Nelson, I'm going to bring him on in a second. And it is time to bring the fabulous Nelson A. Dennis on. Nelson, how are you?
It's an honor to be on your show. Thank you very much, Julio. The time is right.
And the time is right. So, Nelson, I decided that to give you a whole lot because I wanted to do sort of this long conversation about the book, about how you wrote this, about everything. And I don't want you. And I want to do an hour. I've read the book twice. War Against All Puerto Ricans. And so I really want to get into just the history of it all. But before you get into it, I really want you to start from the very beginning. Because a lot of people think that, you just wrote this book right now, and it's War Against All Puerto Ricans, Revolution and Terror, and America's Colony. And, you have a history, right? We're Harvard guys. We've gotten to know each other the last 2 months, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But tell us, when this really started, when you started writing this book, what made you, because it feels like to me it's always been a journey for you. So please take us from the very beginning to where you are now.
Well, as with a lot of things in life, and actually some of the biggest decisions that you make in life, you don't realize you're making it at the time. I wasn't aware that I was writing a book when the process started just about 40 years ago. I was in college. Well, actually, it even started before that. To take you earlier, as a kid, my mother was Puerto Rican from Gagua. My father was Cuban, and they worked very hard. Had a little apartment here in Washington Heights, New York City, and my father was very active and very vocal and inspired about the revolution in Cuba, and he was very pro them. And he used to have a lot of meetings in our house, and one of those meetings was fateful because a Puerto Rican filmmaker named Juan Luis Piguet came and he showed some important films in our house. But those meetings and the network that he was a part of made him visible when the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred in 1962. The FBI came one morning around 3 in the morning, and they knocked on the door. I don't remember if there was paperwork or not. I was only 8 years old. But they came in and took him away, and they deported him to Cuba, and we never saw him again. My mother tried to reinstate.
You never saw that ever did?
Never saw him. Wow. I got some letters from him over the years. The last one was in the 70s, and then he died at a relatively early age in 1983 in Cuba. So he had a hard life. He had a hard life over there. They deported him. They deported him back to Cuba. They accused him of being a 62. Right during this was right after the period of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It happened around November of 19. It was October Missile Crisis. They rounded up the usual suspects, I suppose, and my father was one, and they accused him of being a G2 Cuban intelligence agent, and he was gone. So that's something that was stayed with me. I didn't know I was 8 years old, but I just knew that representatives of the American government didn't approve of my father having meetings, took him away. And with each passing year and decade, it became a more significant event in my life because that was my family. I was an only child, so I had a lot of time to think about it. So that factored with regard to my book, because that factored into my personality. I became pretty studious because I figured that my mother was working very hard in the garment center in La Correa. I couldn't really. There was no margin for error in our family. Basically, we had to do things right, and my job was to be a good student. So I didn't. led to my getting a scholarship to Harvard. My first year there, I remember the young lords were very active in New York City at the time. So I went into the big library, the wider library. It looks like the Greek Parthenon. And
yeah, I know it very well.
Right?
So when did you get to Harvard? When did you come in?
I went 72 to 77. I took a year off and then moved to Puerto Rico. But when I went 72, just to get my bearings, to see, because I'd known that Albizu Campos was the first Puerto Rican to go to Harvard, and the first Puerto Rican to go to Harvard Law School, that he was brilliant, that he graduated valedictorian from Harvard Law School, that he spoke 6 languages, that he had a degree in chemical engineering and in law, that he was the president of the Cosmopolitan Club at Harvard, which was the International Affairs Club, and through that he met Eamon de Valera and other Irish revolutionaries, and that became a lifelong relationship, and that Albizu even had a hand in drafting the Constitution of the Irish Republican Free State at the invitation of Eamon de Valera. There was a legend of Albizu. There was a famous debate in Sanders Theater where he defended the Free Irish Republic, and a British lord who was there in attendance stood up, and despite his being completely in opposition, stood up and announced that Albizu Campos had given the speech of the evening. Albizu accomplished great things at Harvard. So I went.
Yeah, so you went, and I went to the library.
So you're in the library, and I looked back to read up on Albizu, and Julio, there was not one. The writer is very proud to announce that they have 57 miles of books, 3 million.
Yeah, no, I think you've been down there.
Yeah, 8 floors down.
Yeah, 8 floors down. You've been down at the stacks. You've all been there. I mean, I went to school. People go down.
And then you have a couple. Julio, have you heard? Some of the things that people go down. Like, see, 3 weeks ago, then I go to look for them. Show up. So I went down. I didn't take 3 weeks, but what I found looking through the card catalog everywhere, there was not one single book on Albizu Campos. He didn't exist at Harvard that had the largest university library in the country. And so that it got me thinking. Here I am, but where do I fit in this? Not that being Puerto Rican was the only defining element, the only personal identifier, but it was a big part of it, and it made me think about my father. So after 2 years, Harvard provided a lot of options, but very little direction. And so it took some time, and a big part of that, the year I took off, was to go to Puerto Rico, just learn about my family and just sort of reintegrate my past. And I spoke with a uncle who lived in Caguas, who had been a nationalist and had been it turned out one of Albizu Campos' bodyguards when he came back from jail in 1948, and when the FBI was following him around. And he started just telling me stories, and some of it was really like something out of a spy novel, and I had no idea the kind of things that were happening with the FBI and people chasing each other and armed threats and the revolution of 1950, the United States bombing 2 towns, all of this. So one thing one person led to another. It just became fascinating. It was a personal story involving my family. I wasn't writing a book, and so I talked to a number of people during that year. I established a comfort level and a friendship with some of my uncle's friends, and then we stayed in touch. When I went back to Harvard, I felt more grounded in the things that I had suspected, the things that were important to me. I joined the Harvard Political Review, which is the undergraduate government newspaper. I became one on the editorial board, and I ended up writing an article on the Puerto Rican Constitution and the plebiscite of 1952 that became the cover story in 1977 when I graduated of the Harvard Political Review. And it was kind of a stir because people really haven't considered that, especially at a place like Harvard. So by the time I graduated, I felt vindicated that I had spent my years well, and that I had just a better consciousness of myself going forward. I decided to go to law school. When, but all that time, when I left Harvard with another place for law school, I always kept going back. Mostly once a year, but sometimes more, on the average about once a year. And so that's about over 3,000 times that I've come back. And always there was a conversation that would evolve, that would continue. And so I began to see that there was just something that had not been told. There was some information. Marisa Rosado wrote a great biography on Albizu Campos. Federico Sines Novar wrote another one. Miniseo Bruno wrote a great documentary type book about the revolution itself in 1950. Heriberto Marin Torres was one of the prisoners in La Princesa. He wrote a great book about that experience. But there were a lot of docs that hadn't been put together. And then as the years went on, I became an editor, the editorial director of El Diario for the masthead editorial. And that put me in contact with other people. And I accessed more information. And so it was just building. Then finally, in the year 2000, Congressman Jose Serrano convinced, he's on the Appropriations Committee, which determines the budget of the FBI. And with that leverage, he, in a friendly way, convinced the then FBI Director Louis Freeh to disgorge the carpetas, which had been accumulated over 50 years, which are the secret police files that they had kept on over 100,000 Puerto Ricans. They contained roughly 1.8 million pages of classified, private, extremely intimate and granular information about people's lives. It all came out. And I was able to FOIL requested Freedom of Information Law, go to the Center for Rican Studies, and in different sources, I was able to read these. And what I saw in these FBI files started to make my blood boil. The way they treated the nationalists during the 30s, the way they suppressed any information, the way some people started disappearing, the way they applied Gag Law 53 so that nobody could talk on the island about certain subjects, or they could go to jail for 10 years. The things that happened to Albizu Campos and other nationalists, especially Albizu Campos, in jail, that were unspeakable, that clearly indicate that there was a long-term torture of Albizu Campos and other people. When I started seeing this, and then I remembered my father's experience, and it was at that time I said, there's a story here, it hasn't been told, and I'm just angry enough. I've always had the information, but there's enough fury built inside me that it's time to write this book. And that's when the decision was made.
So again, we're talking with Nelson A. Dennis, author of War Against All Puerto Ricans. We started with why he wrote the book. And so if you're listening right now, we're going to go for the next 45 minutes sort of continuing this. But I do want to raise the issue of Albizu Campos because, you said that, as a Harvard, we're both Harvard guys, and I don't think we fit the Harvard mold in a lot of ways. As we came into this, I think, getting into Harvard, we didn't do the traditional path, but when you mentioned something that I just want to talk about for a couple minutes, that he spoke at Sanders Theater. And for people that don't understand Harvard and what it is, Sanders Theater is iconic in a lot of ways. It's a place where it's right near the Memorial Hall. It's a place where, you take class, you've taken classes there, I've taken classes there. So when you hear things about Albizu Campos speaking there, and 100 years or 80 years, whatever it is, and seeing that he broke the mold. He went to Harvard in the 1910s, and the fact that life was not recorded in the Wagner Library, and I know this is getting very granular, but I don't want to belabor this point, but it's something that's really important. That, to me, talks about the erasure of history.
Absolutely.
And for the Irish, the Irish movement, Ada de Valera, and they were meeting here at Harvard, and that's, growing, being there and seeing, having that experience, and being able to be exposed to other minds. I mean, there's a part of me that when I think about that, it just is chilling for me that we both went there. And and I just want to bring that up before we get into the book, because I don't think people realize the enormity of someone like Albizu Campos at a time when you think about what Harvard produced at the time. We're talking presidents, we're talking Roosevelt, we're talking, the elites of America. And here is this Puerto Rican guy from Ponce who comes from a broken family, who was adopted, right? He was adopted. I mean, he lost his parents. And here he is, at 7 years old, he gets off Cambridge, Massachusetts, gets to speak in Sanders Theater, and no one knows about that. That's the part that just blows my mind. And what do you think about that?
So it's even more impressive because it wasn't as if the veil of censorship was thrown over it. It's worse than that. The pen was never put on the paper in the first place. It's not like they went and speciously removed every book. The books weren't even written. Because what was happening is that Puerto Rico, if you've heard the term, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, well, what happened in Puerto Rico never happened at all. If you think back a century ago, there was no television, internet, commercial air flights at all. We were separated by between Washington and New York and Puerto Rico, about 3,000 or 4,000 miles. So 3,000 or 4,000 miles of ocean, a language, a culture, 400 years of Ibero-American history. It was just a place that was just so far removed. And to further contextualize it, this is something that I mentioned in my book. After the Spanish-American War and Puerto Rico was incorporated as an unincorporated territory, they were discussing in Congress what to do with Puerto Rico, because there was pressure internally. Like Luis Muñoz Pineda was one of the people who was Luis Muñoz Marin's father and was pushing for his rights. And there was a guy named Jose Esparza who was sort of pulling and pushing and pulling in different ways. So it was a real debate. Well, Senator Albert Beveridge went on the floor of the U.S. Senate, and there was a strong counter-opposition because Puerto Rico had very strong geopolitical significance at the time as a naval polling station. Because in 1898, the right foot, we still weren't flying. So Puerto Rico is the first major landmass when you're coming from Europe. The first major landmass that you encounter. And it's also a part of a gateway. If you just look at the map, because Cuba's sort of like tucked in. Cuba's huge, but it's tucked in. And if you're looking to navigate waters of North America to Southwest, Puerto Rico was very strategically located. And especially if Cuba was almost like non-negotiable. It was pretty much on its path to independence. But Puerto Rico was up for grabs. So Senator Albert Beveridge says that God made us adept in government so that we may administer government among savages and senile people. Another governor, Senator William Bates, who had been a major general in the Civil War in the Confederate Army, so get a sense of where he's coming from. He described Puerto Ricans as, on the floor of the Senate, a heterogeneous mass of mongrels make up their membership. They're savages addicted to headhunting and cannibalism. Headhunting and cannibalism in that island. New York Times wrote, Puerto Ricans are, and this is a quote, uneducated, simple-minded, and harmless people who are only interested in wine, women, music, and dance. Scribner's wrote, all Puerto Ricans do not seem to mind wallowing in the most abject moral degradation. These are, when you consider the New York Times, Scribners, right, U.S. senators, you have across the board is a consensus here that Puerto Ricans are incapable of governing themselves, that we're doing them a big favor, that we're colonial benefactors, and that it is in their own best interest if we lead them by the nose, because they are like a backward third world. The imagery that existed at that time. You think fighters. If you look at the images that come from the Tarzan movies, the Aborigines, and the pygmies that they put in those movies, or the way that they portrayed Native Americans in the early cowboy movies, well, Puerto Rico pretty much fit into that mold, but with the added disadvantage of it being separated by an ocean. It took 4 days on a nonstop transceiver to get from the island up to New York or Washington. Who would take that? Who would make that trip? Well, only people that have, some mission, some vested interest, some role in it. So the flow of information was extremely restricted and easily controlled. So the outlook, the opinion that there was, and the sense of what the United States' relation to Puerto Rico was almost preordained, because the United States all across the board had a feeling of manifest destiny, and that they were the leaders of the free world. What did that do in Puerto Rico? Well, that was a prelude to plunder. Because the first thing you do is you dehumanize, you marginalize people, so then it's possible to treat them like something less than human beings, someone that you don't have to take into account. And that's exactly what was done. And we'll get into the discussion that, we've got half phenomena, but Julio, that's what's being done to Puerto Rico now as well. Because that attitude led...
We're going to get into that.
Yeah. Within 20 years,
I think the argument...
Yeah, within 20 years, the United States owned 80% of the farmland in Puerto Rico, because they had already created the psychological and philosophical groundwork for it. Now they're doing the same thing. You sent me an article about Social Security, about 218 people receiving Social Security. Well, and I'm jumping the gun, but
because 218 people, because they can't speak English, they're getting disability. But we're going to talk about that after.
We'll talk about that.
Yeah,
no, the point is, Julius, the same attitude. Yeah. First, they downgrade you, so they lay the groundwork for coming in and taking over.
Right. No, you're right. I think that argument that you're talking about, and you're making reference to a Washington Post article that came out, that came from an Associated Press article, that came from an independent audit of the Social Security Administration, saying that, that the headline is the fact that, Puerto Ricans are getting disability benefits because they can't speak English. And it's an incredible, but there is a history to that, and I want to get to that towards the end. But let's get into the book, because I want to get into the fact of how the book is organized, and I really want to know, we're going to talk about the 3 sections, and the way the book is organized is you have it by facts, people, and then events, right? And it's about 23 chapters, and the first part, you really try to lay down, you open up with La Princesa, which is a notorious, people that know Puerto Rican history, it's a notorious, it's a black cell. It's not just a prison, it's a, the stories of Puerto Rico, and I grew up to these stories as well, and, my family is from Caguas as well, through Juncos, and then, we're from Caguas. But one of the things, when you talk, you get into, you talk about the schools, how and my weather was affected, because when he was growing up, is that you couldn't speak Spanish in school, and you were being taught English, and this was about in the late, 1910s and the 1920s, before the Depression. You talk about, the Ponce Massacre, but we got to talk about Chapter 8, because Chapter 8, to me, is sort of your central thesis about this, and Chapter 8 is called It's Only Chinatown. And I'm a film buff, and I'm sure you are, because if you wouldn't talk about It's Only Chinatown if you weren't a fan of the movie Chinatown with Jack Nicholson. And that, to me, was the beginning of the narrative that you're trying, you're still presenting the facts, but talk about why you name, why you call this It's Only Chinatown. Because I think this is, to me, is how you set up the rest of it.
Well, it's from the Polanski movie, there's a great conspiracy to take over the water rights in Los Angeles, and it's a detective story that's complete with real estate corruption, murder, incest, and all sorts of government chicanery. And he gets, when Jack Nicholson, the main character, finally gets to the bottom of it, he sees that it's even deeper and darker than what he thought. And it involves everyone. The corruption goes from the top to the bottom of the local government. But just as it finally happens at the end, he gets so enraged that he's going to do something that, like what the nationalists would do, that would be to finally to explode. But a friend of his says, "Forget it, Jake. It's only Chinatown." So they're in a very poor area where things can happen in the middle of the night, where people get away with things. And so that was the theme for Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico was a place where the United States from the beginning would just send a wave of carpetbaggers year after year to the island like a plague of locusts. For 50 years, Puerto Rico became the land of second chances. It's a place where king relations, family embarrassment, Ivy League alcoholics, political hacks, they could all go down and seek their fortunes with little or no oversight from up north, because, after all, it's only Chinatown. So that again with this framework of Puerto Rico being a land of cannibals and savages, headhunters, right, as they were called. It's like, well, if that's the case, we can go down there and whatever we say goes, because the bar is so low. So this chapter is about the succession. It just takes four of the cavalcade of corruption that was sent down to Puerto Rico in the name of good government, the governors. And what the essential one was Blanton Winship, who was sent down specifically to militarize the entire police force. He was a general, and he was known as a very successful in dealing with let's call it native populations, and they sent him down for that reason. It was after an island-wide agricultural strike that Albizu Campos had led and negotiated that resulted in doubling the wages of the lecheteros, the sugarcane workers. The United States hadn't paid much attention to Albizu Campos up until then. But once he led, negotiated, and succeeded with that island-wide strike, that is when they sent down Blanton Winship, and his wingman was the chief of police, E. Francis Riggs, whose father was the president of the Riggs National Bank, which is across White House, right? So the huge structure right across the White House, and it was known for money laundering for right-wing dictators and for financing political takeovers in South and Central America for 40 or 50 years, together with the CIA. It was part of that shadow government and shadow financing that was employed in South and Central America with the Riggs Bank. Well, this fellow was the son of the president. He's the chief of police. The moment he goes down there, things start happening real fast. People start getting fouled, secret police files that are created, and people disappear or get shot. And in October 1934, in what became known as the Rio Piedras massacre, three nationalists, four people were assassinated in broad daylight by Riggs' police force. And when convening a press conference to explain that to the whole island by way of either apology or mollifying or contextualizing what he did, that wasn't necessary in his view, because his idea was to subordinate, frighten, and terrorize the island. That's why he was sent down. So when asked about at the press conference what's going on, he simply said that if Albizu Campos and the nationalists continue to agitate the sugarcane workers and organize the university students, that there would be war to the death against all Puerto Ricans. That's what Francis Riggs said after the Rio Piedras massacre, and that's why I thought it was a very fitting title for this book. What you see in certain high points in Puerto Rican history, to the Rio Piedras massacre, the Ponce massacre, the revolution of 1950, the Carpeta Fuga, you see some high points of drama, the kind of thing that you would see in a movie. But what you don't see is the steady drip drop of oppression, the constant weight of a dominant empire that's telling you exactly what will do, what to do, what you can't do, and hiring people thousands of people to follow other people all around the island so that it became brother against brother. It was so infiltrated that Abisu Campos, the Nationalist Party, had a youth group called the Cadets of the Liberating Army, the Cadet Corps. And at one point, they had close to 10,000 young cadets. The person, the chief, commander-in-chief of the cadets was named Raimundo Diaz Pacheco. He was basically Abisu's right-hand man, essentially his most trusted man. But what was not known, and what I found out through the FBI reports that were declassified, that I told you became so important to this book, is that Raimundo had a brother who was perfectly named. He was named Faustino. Not only Faustino, he sold his little soul. Faustino Diaz Pacheco, the brother of Raimundo, was an FBI informant for 20 years, informing on every aspect, the command structure, membership, the meeting of location, agenda, planning, financing. Every aspect of the cadets of the Liberating Army was informed by Raimundo's brother Faustino to the FBI. So there's a real tragic component, and in a sense that's a microcosm, that little relationship there with the whole rest of the island, because it's at the highest levels of the Nationalist Party that we're hoping to have a united front to tell the world, show the world that there was something wrong in Puerto Rico, and that some people were willing to stand up to it. If at the highest levels the FBI infiltrated that, literally brother against brother, imagine what was going on in all the rest of the island. And so, rather than this book, is a war against Puerto Ricans, it's sort of a continuing psychological pressure, which is sometimes just becomes psychological terror. And that is something that I hope the reader takes away, because when the shooting stops and the bodies are counted, people think that the story ends. It doesn't end. It stays in our memory, our personalities, our national DNA, and it speaks to us in the present. And that's why this book, I think, has a lot of resonance and a lot of meaning for us today in Puerto Rico.
Right, and the part of all this, and you touched on so many things, and again, we're talking with Nelson Dennis, author of War Against All Puerto Ricans. It just came out last week. It's actually a number one bestseller in a couple of Amazon categories. But the part that I think you're bringing up, that it just seems so fantastical, in the sense of, when I read it, I read this twice, and I was stuck on the Chinatown, Jack Nicholson, James and Tony Chinatown, because it does have sort of a Pulp Fiction type deal, and you kind of move into that when you talk about the second section, which is called The People, where you talk about Windows Marin and how the FBI was investigating him, and they said he had an opium addiction problem, and it helped him. It's so fantastic, right? And it almost seems unbelievable. And you talk about the movie director who filmed Bote Massacre and showed how the Insular Police was staging sort of the reaction at a time when you're controlling U.S. media and trying to tell the story in El Mundo. And you talk about the Academy of Truth, which was a black cell. And it just feels to the reader that this is all made up, right? and it's really hard to, and one of the things that I get out of the book, Nelson, is, and you talking about brother against brother, and you keep talking about the perpetuation of this type of attitude, that even now the reaction when you're writing the book, that people don't believe you, because, and some people don't believe you because that attitude of that has become sort of ingrained in the Puerto Rican psyche. You know what I mean? That you're coming out with something, and there's going to be the typical boricua, bueno, tú sabes, esto es algo político, esto tiene agenda, or, what do you say to them? Because I'm reading this, and I was outraged. And I'm not the only person that has read this and understands Puerto Rican history. And you've totally, you're challenging conventional thinking. A lot of the stuff that was talked about in this, these stories have been covered before, but they've never been covered in a way that get to sort of a retelling and kind of connecting all the dots. And that's where challenged here in a good way. Well, what do you say to all that?
Well, the most important thing in that question is they don't have to believe me. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. There isn't any element of belief. Don't if you've heard the song "Don't Believe Me, Just Watch." Well, don't believe me, man. Read the footnotes. There's over 700 footnotes. I knew that I was going into an area of very real, very documented, but previously uncharted history. And so I was very careful. I treated it as if it was a law journal note with a greater weight of footnoting in some cases than the main narrative itself. It's almost 100 pages of footnotes.
You don't have 100 pages.
Yeah.
Many chapters, 100 pages of footnotes.
Yep. And I give specific pages, the references, and the specific page citations for everything. And then in some cases, we just put the image of the document itself. When we talk about Raimundo Díaz Pacheco being a 20-year informant in the book, we have a very large image of that portion of the FBI report where you can see it. And then there's a footnote right underneath it with the page citation for the FBI report, so that there is at no point was there any element of factual extraction or interpolation or influence. All these key points are a matter of record. So what people are challenged to do then is to step back a little bit, just a little bit, and think of this whole new paradigm. Because the clues have been there, the dots have abounded. They just weren't connected. It's, I guess, equivalent to D. Brown's "Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee." Like, people were so acclimated to seeing cowboy and Indian movies, where we were so inculcated that I, as a kid, many times said, "You're an Indian giver. Give that back." The idea of the term of an Indian giver, in other words, that the Indians were the ones that would be taking things back, and it was the exact opposite. And sometimes, the way that you perpetrate and confuse people is with the big lie, and if you just say it often enough, literally hundreds of times, eventually that big lie sticks. Did we find weapons of mass destruction? Just a recent example. You just put, there's an official a state-sponsored narrative that is simply regurgitated, and that was very possible in Puerto Rico. It lends itself to it. An example: in the 1937 Ponce massacre, where 17 unarmed, 19, but 2 of them police caught in their own crossfire. 200 people, Puerto Ricans, over 200 were grievously wounded. Some were maimed for life, and 17 were just killed right there. Gunshots, men, women, and children. All of them unarmed. Everyone. Not one weapon was found. There was an investigation by something called the Hayes Commission that did a 2-week, very serious, in-depth investigation, and the conclusions were unambiguous, clear. They called it a massacre. No weapons were found, and yet they were willing, the United States, and so cynically, to put out their own story, that they literally rearranged the corpses of the dead people on the street so they could choreograph specific photographs, which were put in El Mundo, which the untutored reader, the viewer, would see the photograph, and it would appear that the police were shooting out of frame, that there was some people that they were shooting at out of frame. But what you did not see is that there's no one out of frame, because they were all dead. In some those photographs, you actually see an empty street. The police are shooting very seriously into an empty street, and you actually see 2 or 3 corpses in that street. And it was so ridiculous that the Island Press, a few days later, they took the same picture of these police looking up at the rooftop at non-existent nationalist snipers, and they made a joke out of it. They made a caricature of these same guys with a caption underneath: "Ahora podemos decir que nos tirotearon desde las azoteas." Now we can say that they were shooting at us from the rooftop. It was that ridiculous. And yet, stateside, the New York Times, the Detroit News, major all the major organs of U.S. communication were reporting it as a nationalist riot and a gunfight, meaning that there were two sides shooting at each other. It was where did they get that information? It was completely, and so they just completely flipped the script. They told a whole different story, but you could get away with that because the only reporting services were AP and UPI, which is about half a dozen to 10 reporters that, living, kind of living large in Puerto Rico and, writing these stories that were
right. And there was a filmmaker that was there that, there's famous footage that was shown that he would go around. What's his name again? I'm sorry.
Yes. Yeah. It was like the Zapruder film. Right, yeah, it was like the Zapruder film of Puerto Rican politics.
Right, and he would show what happened. I would always sit back when I hear about it, and I've known these stories. I mean, part of what I love about this book is that you put a freshness on stories that I've already known. But you have a thread about connecting the dots. But that film, which I'm absolutely convinced in this day and age, the age of YouTube and digital media, if that film was ever shown, like, when you see Metropolis or something that you see on YouTube, a movie from a previous era, I think people would be like, what happened? And that's part of this entire conversation and part of this book is that even the people that know the history of this are being challenged, but the people that don't know the history of this are going, wait a minute, the United States sent bombers to towns in Puerto Rico and they bombed their own citizens? Because when you think about it, Puerto Ricans are American citizens. If the United States would bomb, say, Kansas or the South in the 21st century, we'd be still talking about it today. I don't think the American populace, if you told them, if you went on national TV tomorrow and someone asked you, he said, did you know that the United States has bombed its own citizens? And people are like, what?
And it was so much a matter of record that there was a front page headline covered the whole page in Imparcial that said "Bombardean el Utuado." But also, when I have a copy of it there, and you can see on the internet because I got it from the internet. There's a New York Times story that said that Hayuya the next day looked like an earthquake had hit it. So except that what the New York Times additionally put in there is that they claim that the nationalists were the ones that burned their own town, where they lived and where their friends and family lived, and left it like an earthquake.
Well, it's funny you say that because when we were preparing for this interview, there was a young man that tweeted me because he was very excited about the book, and he mentioned the fact that his great uncle, I believe, was in Utuado at the time, and he's heard the stories about. I mean, my thing is, it's like, I don't, at this day and age, I just, when these stories get brought up and you bring them up in a typical politiqueria that is Puerto Rico, it becomes nationalist legend, nationalist myth. Because at the time, and you brought up, you wrote a lot of essays for Latino Rebels, but you brought up an interview from Governor Muñoz Marin right after the nationalist, I don't know if it was Truman's assassination attempt or the Congress attempt when they actually shot, but when Muñoz Marin went to D.C. to do sort of like a meet the press, at the time in 1950, where he's talking about this all about radicals and communists during the revolution of 1950. And I think there's this perception on the island that this history is legend and myth and has been exaggerated. And part of the history is that we as a people, we as Puerto Ricans have snuffed out that own history because when you have the governor of Puerto Rico saying, hey, these are radicals, these are communists, and I'm talking to Washington, D.C., You know what I mean?
Well, yeah. Well, we'll put it in context, and I think should if you make this empathic leap where you just sit for a moment and just even close your eyes and visualize what the scenario that I'll describe. If you have an island that is taken over in 1898, and in the following year has one of the most devastating hurricanes in its history, Hurricane Santiago. The entire year's coffee crop was ruined. It peeked over, and there's a newspaper. That's another thing that I think for article. Over 100,000 people on the island, their homes were blown away by the hurricane. It was that bad. In 1899, year after the U.S. coming, and the United States sent in no hurricane relief at all. Instead, the following year, they devalued the Puerto Rican peso, which was an equal buying power to the American dollar. They devalued it, and they said you have to turn it in, get the American currency was now currency, and each Puerto Rican peso was now worth 60 American cents, including the ones that you have in the bank, including any contracts or any real estate. Everything is now what was worth $1 is now worth 60 cents. So the reason I'm saying is provide a context for people to believe these other things. Julio, think of the violence of that in a real sense. That is a much greater violence in a sense than the bombing of the two towns. If you devalued everyone's bank account here in this country by 40%, by fiat, legislative fiat. I mean,
people in the streets, and we ride us. The whole United States would implode. It would not exist. Is it fair to say that it would destroy the country? Is that an exaggeration? That'd be right. I mean, if you think about right now, think about how the United States changed because the very large world powers. How the United States changed with two large buildings, or how the U.S. economy, how many things were there. The ripple effect of just that. Right? But what would the ripple effect be if a foreign power did some sort of internet scam or something and hacked into our systems and sucked 40% of our money and our national wealth away somehow? Wow, right? Think about it. So that was the violence that was done to Puerto Rico within 2 years. And then the year after that, the Hollander Act, the United States then imposed deeply graduated property taxes on every farmer in Puerto Rico that they never paid before. So between a hurricane, a currency devaluation, the Hollander Act, and then usurious loans, amazing rapacious loans from the American colonial bank that the farmers couldn't afford, well, within 20 to 30 years, 80% of all the farmland was owned by the United States. That is the violence. So when you think about the bombing and the Ponce massacre, in a sense, that's just like that's just a minor. That's an eruption of what's been going on. There's been a volcanic level of pressure placed on that island, and so if you just look at it within that context, you can see, well, of course, when they had that much money is involved, and the United States has that much of an interest. Well, you know how funny things get when money is involved, and in a sense, that's what's happening in Puerto Rico now. Things that we couldn't believe, and when you explain it to them, you have to really sit them down and say, wait a minute, connect these dots, and then tell me that there isn't, a massive squeeze being put on the island that is almost analogous to what was done in 1898. Right. So before we wrap this up, you believe like we could talk? I mean, we could probably talk about this for 3 hours. We're gonna have to get you back on again, my friend. But one of the things when we move to the last part of the book, the events, and it talks about the revolution in 1950. It talks a lot about the very strong. I mean, the fact that at least some folks died of radiation from the U.S. puts, you present a very convincing case. But I really want you to talk about Chapter 19, which is Salón Boricua. And I have to commend you, my friend. When I read that the shootout at Salón Boricua, and, I talked to my dad about it, who was young at the time, and I've talked to to other family members. And, the shootout at San Boricua was the first live breaking news radio Puerto Rico nationalist barber. Literally, it's like a Tarantino movie, man. Yeah, you wrote it like a Tarantino movie. And I know the story. I know what happened, but I never got to listen to the broadcast, and we were able to find a YouTube about, live from Santurce, this is happening, and it's just amazing. And it's on LatinoRebels.com where you say, if you Google shootout at San Boricua, listen to that again. Yeah, that story, of all this book, that story about the barber fighting is, to me, one of the pinnacles of the book. And I want to know a little bit about why you wrote it that way. Like, because as a writer, as a fellow author, as a fellow friend, it felt to me like when you wrote it, there must have been a little, as a writer, you're like, I got this. I totally got this. I'm writing a movie. I mean, how did that feel? Yeah. Talk about that for a couple minutes, and then we're going to wrap this up.
Well, Pirata de los Diaz was a barber, and he owned the San Boricua barbershop in the Barrio Obrero, the working area of Santurce. Santurce was just a mile away from Las Casas, where the Buccaneers and the Puerto Rican regiment would train, but it's U.S. Army would train. And for decades, there has been a weapons exchange from Camp Las Casas into San Boricua. That's why, because it was just so close to the base. And his barbershop was like many barbershops. People come in and they talk. So it was like a community center, that place. And Vidal, because of his personal history, which is covered in the book, and because of a torture experience that he went, and because he was one of Alvira Campos' closest friends, was also surrounded by FBI at all times. And when the revolution broke out, she attacked him. Okay, so it was one barber versus 40 police and National Guardsmen. And when the island heard about this was a Quentin Tarantino movie. Over a dozen radio stations rushed in. And it was the first island-wide radio broadcast in the history of Puerto Rico. The first live. It is happening now. Breaking news. Come fight. And with everybody, including Puerto Ricans in the band, they thought there must have been like 2 dozen nationals in there because they were shooting furiously. First of all, that proof that he was getting story ammunition, because if he's able to, if the gunfight lasted over 3 hours, he shot a lot of bullets from a lot of different guns. Because you can't reload. You gotta be shooting. So you can read that story. So he's like running from window to window, throwing Molotov cocktails. He has a semi-automatic. He has a pistol. He has people rushing behind the car. He's keeping everybody at bay for 3 hours. They finally had to shoot the decimator place so much that the stairs fell on his head. They had to collapse the barbershop onto his head, and it knocked him out. In the process, he got a chunk of his cheek taken off, and 3 fingers were blown off his left hand. He's still fighting. He can't be too down. Like, man, and then he's like, when he's down, it's like, he's like still alive, and he's a samurai movie. Yeah, he's down. He's dead. They want to go make sure. So the National Guard goes in, and a guardsman at point blank range shoots him in the head. Yeah, it shoots him, right? Puts the gun to him and it shoots him. This motherfucker, I'm sorry. This man is doing, I'm sorry, forgive me. So they're not hanging the corpse. They're dragging the corpse out, and like to prove, but they're also looking desperately where all these other, because this is very embarrassing, that this little guy, this barber held up, 40 nations of the U.S. finest. So they drag him out, and then all of a sudden, the corpse opens its eyes. And he looks around. And I'm sorry, I'm getting caught up in it again. They thought this guy was like, dead. They thought he was like a zombie. They didn't know what to make of it. And like, that's like Walking Dead. It's like Walking Dead inside Berkshire. It's a big, at that point, that's okay, now I'm going to calm down. At that point is when, that's Santiago, the little barber that cooked, was permanently etched into nationalist and Puerto Rican political legend, because when he was alive, when they said Vidal is alive, that just in a sense incarnated the Puerto Rican fighting spirit, the revolutionary spirit. This was the barber that the empire, with a bullet in his brain, that the empire still couldn't put down. So one of the heroes that emerged from this was Vidal Santiago Diaz, and I can't help but get excited when I think about what he did. And it's just,
No, it's great. It's a triumph. People need to read this book. Listen, it's War Against All Puerto Rican. There's a couple of things that you told me that I'm going to let people know if you're listening. One of them, you mentioned that there's going to be someone is offered to do the Spanish version, and so that's breaking news. So that's good.
Yeah. It's been going on in Facebook and through the social media. It's been a totally unexpected outpouring, and as you said, it's been about Amazon bestseller in all three of the categories now. And a gentleman who has a big reading group, a professor in Puerto Rico, wants it, and he owns a printing publishing company, wants to do it for free. And the Nationalist Party, I spoke with a member today, wants to make the book the centerpiece of one of their organizations, one of their big organization meetings in Ponce. So there's a real life that's right. And it's important because it's more important than the book. It's more important than the book. It's recovering our own national history. And what I'm hoping is that this book opens a process of our greater understanding of ourselves, and it may help the debate now when we talk about the status, independence, or statehood. At least we have a basis of fact from which to take forward that discussion.
Right, and I think people that need to read the book in a lot of ways, because I don't want to shoot this area in the epilogue, but I think it brings the fact of exactly what you're saying. If you want to know how to move Puerto Rico forward, you need to know what's happened. This is definitely a history that has not been told. And, when they do the Spanish version, I mean, you have 100 pages of notes. It's not like it's going to be that hard of a translation job. You probably have all the original sources. Thank you to Hits and all that other good stuff that you've done. But Nelson Dennis, you like I said, I call this book an instant classic. We've become really close friends. Anyone that's interested about Puerto Rican history, about untold histories, about Spanish histories, about the U.S. in the time of about history in the war, about Chinatown. It's only Chinatown needs to get War Against All Puerto Rican. We're going to bring it back because we're going to have another discussion about where does this go next. I could spend enough. And we will bring you back, but best of luck, my friend. This is, I'm really just honored that your book has become so successful. I believe it, and I'm thrilled to talk here with you, and I appreciate the support that Latino Rebels has provided. But you were one of the early places, and you personally, Julio, who recognized the pivotal element of the importance of this book and the history, and I thank you for that. Thank you, my friend. We're out of here. This is Latino Rebels Radio. We'll get Nelson A. Dennis coming back here, but we're going to close out with Stop Leve.
Thank you for using Blog Talk Radio.